welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Turn the Page. I'm your host today, Jen. And today I am joined by the author of a lot of cool things. We will be discussing a few of them here today, and I am so excited for this conversation. So welcome. Could I ask you to introduce yourself and your work, please?
Hi there. My name is Ian Rogers. I'm the author of a few books. There's my debut collection, Every House is Haunted, which is probably the one that people know me most well for, probably because it's been optioned by Sam Raimi. And he's in the process of producing an adaptation, a film adaptation, one of the stories in the book, the House on Ashley Avenue, which was also nominated for a Shirley Jackson Award. So got a lot of mileage out of that story. I also am the author of the novel Sycamore, which is the first book in the Blacklands series, which is sort of like a urban fantasy, supernatural noir series set in a world where the supernatural just sort of exists as a matter of course, and explores the way of different people and how they are sort of existing in a world where paranormal has become the norm, as it were. And I'm also the author of a novel called Family, which is a kind of like a haunted house story with a bit of a twist that came out last year as well from Earthling Publications. It actually beats Sycamore by about a month. So technically Family is my debut novel, but Sycamore, is the first book in the Blackland series. They're kind of like weird, twisted siblings of each other.
Nice. Yeah, I really enjoyed reading both Every House is Haunted and Sycamore. So perhaps we could start with your short stories and then head into your novel. But before we get into either, maybe just talk a little broadly, a little bit more about your career as a writer, what drew you to horror, and if you wouldn't mind, maybe talking about your experience as a teen UFO investigator, because I was an X-Files kid in the 90s, so that just spoke to me so instantaneously.
Well, then you'll probably understand the story. You'll probably still think I'm a giant geek about this. And of course, I own that. I own that totally. But at least people will know what it is as opposed to maybe, I guess it sort of shows my age. I'm 48 and nothing makes me feel old than someone saying like, what's the X-Files? What's Unsolved Mysteries? What is that? Like, oh, that new show that's on Netflix? It's like, no, not the new one. The classic. If it's not Robert Stack, it's not Unsolved Mysteries, you know? So, I came to horror actually at a really, really young age. My sister and I, growing up, we were more or less allowed to watch whatever we wanted as kids within reason, because my mom loved horror. My dad didn't really like horror very much, didn't have any real use for it. But again, they didn't really believe in sort of censoring us in that way. His rule, though, was that, if you guys have nightmares, you're cut off. So, which I think is fair. We only watched a couple of movies which are really, extremely brutal. We sort of had to turn them off and watch them, finish them the next day. But we, of course, never told my dad that. But yeah, my mom was definitely the influence. She always had Stephen King books and Dean Koontz, John Saul lying around the house, and loved horror movies. Loved the classics like Jaws or The Exorcist, but also loved cheesy slasher movies like Halloween, Friday the 13th, Pirate 24. So it was like a very well-rounded horror education where I could truly appreciate, the highbrow, I guess what they call elevated horror these days. A term I don't really like. I think it's kind of a little snooty, but for me, it's like I write more atmospheric, supernatural fiction. I don't really write what you would say is like gory or splatterpunk, but I'm not against it. I think it's like food, right? I mean, it's like if you don't like a certain type of food, there's nothing wrong with it. You just may not enjoy it. Well, other people really like it a lot. So I think it's just like any genre where it comes in many different shades, different types. And I think they all deserve to be celebrated. So I think people who don't like horror typically think that all horror is gory and violent, and it's not, right? Some of it absolutely is, but not all of it. And I think that's the people that don't like horror, typically that's the reason why. But then you show them something like The Exorcist, or even in some circles, like a movie like The Silence of the Lambs is considered a horror movie. It's a procedural, and it's sort of a serial killer's and a book, obviously, but it's quite dark. I even remember, I think it was David Cronenberg was being asked to give his top 10 scariest movies of all time, and he listed Taxi Driver among them. And someone said, well, Taxi Driver is not a horror movie. And he wasn't trying to be cool. He was just really genuinely mystified. He was like, oh, really? It's like, it scared the hell out of me, you know? So it's, it's this idea that horror isn't a genre, it's an emotion. So you can see that in different types of stories where, yeah, you've got a marketing campaign will say this is horror, but you know, when you go to a bookstore, they have a horror section and they need to be able to quantify these things and put them in a place where you're going to look for them. But horror as a type of story it's everywhere.
I love that point. That is so interesting to me. Yeah, and because horror can be very extremely personal and subjective. So I feel like yeah, describing horror as an emotion or a mood is like a really interesting way to think about it. You've already talked about some of the stories that are in your horror DNA. Could you talk a little bit more about maybe the properties that you felt like were in your sort of mental space, like while you were crafting these stories? I imagine they were crafted throughout your career, but I'm just curious about how the volume came together and sort of like your assembly process and like what sort of things you were drawing on. That's huge. I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. I mean, ostensibly, I mean, every house is haunted. So I think there's obviously a certain emphasis on haunted house stories. At the same time, I knew it wasn't going to be a book of 22 haunted house stories. I think that would be kind of redundant after a while. And there's actually only one negative review of someone who was like, very put out that it wasn't 22 stories about haunted houses. I thought that was actually pretty funny. But there was never any complaints by anyone else when there was like a creepy spider story, or there's one that's even a little bit sci-fi in it, the difference between us, where it's like it's not like flying cars and teleportation, but it's this idea of exploring death as a place, as another dimension. So for me, it was just really trying to explore all the different facets of horror that had, terrified me, entertained me, really stuck in my brain as a kid or growing up as a young reader and writer, and then trying to do my own thing. So Every House is Haunted was really using the haunted house as a metaphor for haunted lives. That's why I say every house is haunted, because every house, every life is haunted in some way. It's sort of what goes on behind closed doors. Like it's something that I thought was really interesting. It's been a discussion that people talk about today with trigger warnings, and how some people will say trigger warnings work or trigger warnings don't work. And the people that say that trigger warnings don't work is they say that trigger warnings are actually very personal. So, I mean, you could have trigger warnings for all the usual stuff like violence or sexual abuse or things that you see even in warnings in movies and television shows. But other people who have said their triggers are very personal, and they don't expect to see a warning for something very obscure, something that triggers them on a book because it is so personal. So I think there's a good argument either way for that sort of thing, because again, horror is very personal. It's something that you're trying to really scare someone, even disturb them on a certain level. I'm not trying to hurt anybody, but this is sort of the business that you're in, is writing horror fiction. Where at the same time, I'm very empathic to people, and I don't want to hurt anybody. So I'm definitely not against the warnings, but I also understand the argument that triggers can also be very personal. And I think that's why you see these warnings going hand in hand with horror fiction, because no one worries about trigger warnings typically with literary fiction or a Western. There's not really a big argument, but if you go in the horror community and you send up your flag about posting a tweet or a post about trigger warnings, you're going to get all kinds of people jumping on that thread with very, very strong opinions. So, but I get it. Horror is a powerful thing. It's very cathartic. It's very polarizing in some ways of what's scary. There's nothing more token in terms of horror reviews than the reviewer who's like, oh, I didn't like this book because it didn't scare me, And it's just like, I don't really see that as a failure of horror fiction if it doesn't scare you. I mean, I read voraciously and I read all kinds of horror fiction. Very little of it actually scares me. Maybe it's because I've been digesting horror since I was a kid, but I can still really appreciate good writing, and I know there are scenes that have scared me, but this idea that, I read something and it, it so scared me I had to put this book down. I don't know if I've ever read anything like that. I just, I appreciate good writing, I appreciate a good imagination, but that's really more what I'm looking for as a reader and as a writer, what I'm trying to do. And that's what I was trying to do with Every House is Haunted. It sort of collected my first 5 years as a published author. And it's probably a little uneven if I went back and looked at it now, but I think I actually don't mind that. That's what your first book should be. You're always trying to do better with each book, you know.
Absolutely. And I had an artist friend who used to get embarrassed about her early work, and I used to try to comfort her by saying, like, if your early work didn't embarrass you, that would mean that you haven't grown as an artist, and you've grown so much.
Yeah, no, exactly. That's true. Well, when Cemetery Dance reissued the book, it was 10 years later. So I sort of jokingly called it the 10-year anniversary edition. And my editor at Cemetery Dance asked me if I wanted to change anything, or I was like, unless there's spelling mistakes, I'm not touching it, because it'd been 10 years. The temptation to go back and sort of dicker with them would be there. And I just didn't want to do it because it really represented that first book, these short stories that were all published when I was very young. Um, it just wouldn't be right. I would go back and the book would be a completely different book. And I just don't want to do that. It's these books are supposed to exist at a moment in time. I really just wanted the book to be back in print again. It wasn't for me to really dicker with it at all. All I did was update the acknowledgments because of all the movie and TV stuff that had happened with that book since then. So I wanted to acknowledge that in a cool way for the people who that was the reason why they were picking the book up, was because of the Sam Raimi interest in the movie thing that was going on. So that was really the only addition to the book, but it's the same stories, hopefully a few spelling mistakes that were fixed between that and the original edition.
Nice. Yeah, I'd love to talk about a couple stories in particular. One that I really enjoyed was A Night at the Library with the Gods.
Mm.
Partially because it's about a library I have visited. I attended a medieval history conference at University of Toronto once, and I was like, wow, that library is really singular.
Oh yeah, yeah.
So could you talk about that one a little bit?
What's funny, that story is connected to the house on Ashley Avenue. It's this organization that sort of deals with the supernatural. I toned down the connections between those stories. I didn't want to confuse people, because it's supposed to be sort of like a collection where, if you catch those connections, great. If not, it's not going to affect your enjoyment of the stories, I hope. But yeah, if you catch those things, you can it's like a secret society. If you notice the secret handshake, you're like, oh yeah, that story is connected to this one. And for me, it was funny because that story and the house on Ashley Avenue both were inspired by the years I lived in Toronto. And Toronto's a very expensive city. It's even more expensive now, but it was expensive when I lived there in the early 2000s. And so as someone who's, all of my money went towards rent and food, my idea of entertainment was anything that was free. So I would go to libraries or just go for walks. So the house on Ashley Avenue was just a house I saw going for walks, because I like to walk anyway. But again, it's also walking is free. So cheap entertainment. The library was free. So I would go to the library, and I love libraries too. So I went to the library, and, it's writers are magpies, like we see the shiny thing, we pick it up. So, while I'm enjoying myself, getting a little bit of exercise too, I'm picking up ideas for stories. And so that's really where it came from. This idea that there's a world beneath the world that we see is the very genesis of horror fiction. It's sort of taking normal things, dipping them in the supernatural or the paranormal. And so when I was in this library and I knew that they had sort of like a rare books collection, it was like, oh, well, what if there was a part that no one was allowed into because it had all these spooky books? And so that's just where my mind goes. It's sort of, you see the normal thing, and then, well, what if horror, is really what it is, what if horrible things happen? What if this is part of this? What if this is part of that? It's a fun way of looking at the world. You just sort of, you take your imagination off the leash, let it run wild.
Absolutely. I'd love to know about your approach to world building, like both here in the story and maybe in general a little bit, because this is quite a short story, even by short story standards. But you evoke such a rich world with so much mystery, because it gets like hinted at but not really explained. So
Right.
what is your approach to, walking that line between what to show, what not to show?
Oof. I mean, that's the eternal question. It's not even just horror fiction, right? I mean, that's up there with like write what you know, but then like all writing is fiction, and fiction is like lying. So it's like lying creatively, right? Like, how many times have you read something where the author really seemed like they knew what they were talking about, and then you found out later on, like, oh no, I made most of that up. That's not at all. Someone who works in this industry told me that I was completely wrong, but now because this book was really popular, everyone thinks that's how that works. So for me, it's hard because I love doing research. I want things to have as much of a level of verisimilitude as they can, because I think especially with fantasy fiction, whether it's horror or science fiction or high fantasy, whatever, as real as you can make things, whether it's the characters or the setting or a particular scene, as real as you can make it, you're drawing the reader in so that when you bring in the supernatural or the fantasy element, you're throwing them this wicked curveball and they're just going to get hit with it, in the best way possible. They don't even know to swing the bat, much less whether or not they're going to hit it. They're so drawn in by that level of realness. I think that's something that, Stephen King is well known for writing these, scary characters and these great set pieces and these great novels. But he's also really known for writing incredibly believable characters. I'm not talking the villains or the bad guys. I'm just talking like his regular protagonists, these nice people. They seem like our friends and family. That's part of his gift, is that, he makes these people seem so believable and so memorable. And that's all really a plot of a story is. Plot is just stuff happening to people you've been made to care about, and you don't need to like them. You just need to care what happens to them. It's like someone like Hannibal Lecter. The guy's a serial killer and a cannibal, for God's sakes. But he's such a compelling character that you're interested in what's going to happen to him. So when he escapes from the asylum in Silence of the Lambs, you don't really want him to get away because he's a monster, but you kind of want him to get away because it's interesting. Like, how is he going to do it? If anyone could do it, it's this guy. So again, in the real world, it would be awful. You want this person locked up forever. But in a book, they make you not even invested in him because, again, he's a sociopath, but he's fascinating enough that you want to know more about him. And it doesn't excuse the bad things that he does, but that's a gift of the writer, Thomas Harris. So I think that goes with characters as much as it goes with plot, of how much do you tell, how much do you show. Sometimes you really just have to listen to the character or listen to the scene, and sort of like, I think most writers, myself included, we probably tell too much. We probably over-explain because we're worried about not getting our point across. And so my second drafts are almost always taking stuff out. Oh, I don't need to do that. First of all, it's the repetition. First, I repeated myself 5 times. Get rid of those automatically. Now, do I need to do this? No, it's, that needs to be there. This doesn't need to be there. And actually, if I remove this part of it, it's more mysterious and will really have them thinking. And if they're thinking, they're going to keep reading. So it's kind of like putting together a jigsaw puzzle, and then actually you finish it by removing some of the pieces. It's actually not finished until you take some of those pieces away, because you don't need to give them everything. Sometimes that complete picture are the pieces that they create in their minds. The readers, that process of writer to reader relationship is it's telepathy. You don't need to describe every little thing. You just need to give them enough that they are sort of taking it and going on their own way. And that's how I feel about it anyway.
That's a really cool way of looking at it. It's like the first draft is sort of, you discovering the world, and then the second draft is you curating that world for the person who's going to be encountered in the story. Very cool. Can we talk a little bit about the house on Ashley Avenue? I really like that one too. And it is the one that, it has been optioned by Sam Raimi. So could you talk a little bit about, crafting that story? Because I particularly love haunted houses the most of all horror genres, but I always love the psychic scene. And this one opens really great on.
Well, it's funny because, House on Ashley Avenue, it sort of connects with Family, which was my debut novel. And they're both haunted house stories. And it was sort of like, I don't want to get ahead of myself, but when I wrote House on Ashley Avenue, it was, again, I was just going out for a walk one day, and I decided to go through one of the fancier neighborhoods in Toronto, because they have nice houses there, Rosedale. And the sun was going down. And so the opening paragraph was literally the impetus for the whole story. The sun was going down, the street looked like it was dipped in bronze. That was the visual that came to my head, and that's the line that I used in the story to open it, because that's how it was for me, with this beautiful street. It wasn't Ashley Avenue, I think it was Ashley Street. I think I just changed the end of it, or Ashley Road or something. But it's a real street, there's a real house on it. And I just looked at it, and the way that the light was kicking off the windows, it looked like the house was empty. It looked like there was nothing inside, because you could see into the house. And then the idea just popped into my head. What if this house was empty, but what if it was deliberately empty, and some company had left it this way because it was so haunted, so dangerously haunted, that they couldn't let people live in it, and how would the neighbors not be aware of this? Well, the company would make sure it looks lived in. They make sure the lawn is cut, blah, blah, blah. So I just went down this road, and then it coupled with this idea of, well, who would do this? It would have to be a group with power. And this was, again, being a a child of the 90s and the X-Files and, government conspiracies. I thought, well, it would be a government group, but that's been done to death and secret agencies. So I thought, well, what's a group that has just as much power, is also kind of evil? An insurance company. So I just thought I'd never seen that done before, and that the people who have optioned that story over the years, currently up to the present day with Sam Raimi, that story has always been one that resonates with a lot of people, especially in film and TV. And I think that's what it is they've never seen like an insurance company that's sort of like one part X-Files, one part kind of Men in Black, where it's just like you've got this secret organization that has a department that just deals with haunted properties. And are they good or are they evil? They're like people, they're both, that's one of the things. I always equate it to one of the creators of the TV show Lost was saying that the characters on Lost aren't good or bad. They're people who do good and bad things, sometimes simultaneously. Like they're the way that real people are. They're complicated. There's a scene when the people on the island who have been there for a lot longer than anyone else, the others who are ostensibly the bad guys, but the leader refers to himself as the good guys, and we're the good guys, and he's not being flippant. They believe that they're good, they believe that they're the good people. And that was the advice I was given by someone a long time ago when it came to writing villainous characters, is that the bad guys never think that they're bad guys. They think they're the good guys. So that was something that really resonated with me and how I was going to create this group in the Ashley Avenue story that I've continued with the rest of the stories in that series. Go Fish was published as the second story at Tor.com, or it's called Reactor now. And I wrote a third story that hasn't been published yet. It's too long. It's like 25,000 words. So it's like novella length, and it's very hard to place those ones. But there's these 8 properties, the 8 as they're called. And so there's going to be 8 stories. And so I've finished the first 3. The problem is they keep getting longer. So I'm keep making them shorter so that I can actually finish them in my lifetime. But I know what I know that they're all outlined. I know what they're going to be. I know how the series is going to end. I'm just taking my time writing them too. I'm not trying to punch them out. It was 10 years between House on Ashley Avenue and Go Fish. I wrote the third one a lot sooner, and the fourth one is already ready to go. But again, I'm sort of it might be my life's work in terms of I'm taking my time. But one day there will be a book called The 8 that will have all 8 stories in it, chronicling the adventures of the Mirville group and these spooky properties.
I'm so excited to hear that. Yeah, because I'm very curious about the other properties in this 8. When you were talking about using insurance investigators as your protagonists, it sort of provided me a very natural segue to Sycamore, because I think like your use of the insurance investigator harkens back to like classic noir, like a person who is often like investigating like the margins of mysteries. And Sycamore is like a really fun supernatural paranormal noir. So let's talk about that one a little bit. Tell me about the town of Sycamore and the new Blackland series.
Ooh, it's funny because it's new for a lot of people because Cemetery Dance has put out this novel, but I've been writing Blackland stories for like 15 years. I sort of did it backwards, the way that other people do a series. I started with short stories and novellas and chapbooks, kind of like seeding the industry with these short stories. So it was kind of like a word of mouth campaign that, oh yeah, if you know these stories, they're sort of connected, but you can read them all on their own. But I'm sort of just slowly doing this series with this world and this character, Felix Wren, this detective. And it wasn't really intentional. I think it was just I was writing those stories as I was starting my writing career, and I just didn't have the confidence to write a novel because I hadn't written any novels at all, much less a Blacklands novel. And so when I did write Sycamore, I also wanted to make sure it had the right home. I needed a publisher who was going to be really invested in the series. I didn't want this just to be 1 book or 2 books, and then they were done. Because I think with a lot of series, readers are a little gun shy about investing in a series because they don't want to fall off like what happened with Game of Thrones, right? We don't know if those books are ever even going to be finished. So I started as a reader, right? So I want to really be aware of that. So I put a lot of thought into stories and how they're published. So the idea was to do like a book a year, hopefully a book a year, just so that we can sort of have that audience, so that it's they're investing in me and I'm investing in them. It's a mutual relationship when you're doing a series. I want them to know that they're going to get these books, and in a timely manner. So Sycamore was kind of like this silent promise, a delivery on a silent promise I was making with all of these stories for 15 years. But it was really just a matter of trying to find the right home for it. And Cemetery Dance really resonated with it and really understood it. So yeah, it's kind of funny. I always sort of say that it's like a supernatural version of that TV show, The Wire, where it's like, in that TV show, it's like the recurring character was the city of Baltimore. Each season focused on a different group of people, and the cops sort of were the same each season. But season 1 was the police. Season 2 was like the dock workers and stevedores. Season 3 was, I believe, the school system, the teachers. And I think season 4 was like the journalists or something. I can't remember. Maybe getting mixed up a little bit. But the idea was that the characters would change season to season because the real character, the real recurring character, was the city. So that's what I always said with the Blacklands. This is a problem that's affecting the entire world. I could tell stories anywhere. The real recurring character is the Blacklands itself. So while I'm telling a whole bunch of novels with Felix Wren, the detective character, I could also tell novels with other characters. And that's why I've introduced other characters. There's the Jerry Baldwin character who sells haunted houses for a living. I just finished a new novella with him a couple of weeks ago. There's the federal agent character, Alice Baffle, who's introduced in Sycamore. I have ideas for a couple of novels with her. But again, they're all, even tonally, the stories can be different. The Felix Wren stories are classic noirs, supernatural noirs. The Alice Baffle ones would be a lot closer to procedurals, paranormal procedurals. If Thomas Harris and Stephen King wrote novels together, I like to think that that's, or like if, imagine if Clarice Starling from Silence of the Lambs, instead of going to work for behavioral science, she went to work for the X-Files instead at the FBI. So that's the visual I'm trying to get with, they're not just different characters you're following. Tonally, they're very different types of stories. And I think that's kind of shows the versatility of the series, that it really has something for everyone, where at the end of the day, there's still horror. It's about this world where you've got this supernatural pall hanging over everyone's head, that, the supernatural exists. These creatures live right next door to us. We've been trying to pitch we've been pitching a supernatural, a Blacklands movie to the film and TV people in Hollywood. And the way that we sort of explain it to studio executives who don't understand portals and dimensions and stuff, they don't read, right? A lot of them don't read. They've got people that they hire to read for them. But the way that I say it is, because a lot of these guys have got kids. Imagine your kid has a nightmare, think that there's a monster in their closet. You go upstairs to make them feel better, but you can't tell them that monsters don't exist, because monsters exist in this world. What do you tell your kid? So, they're going to learn about the Blacklands in school eventually. That's the world these people live in, these parents, these kids, everybody. So for me, that's the great sort of equalizer of this world. It's like, oh, that's how terrifying this world is. You're probably not going to encounter a supernatural creature on your way to work, on your way to school. It's still fairly rare, but they do exist. This is the reality. So it's a fun world to play in. I still write the standalone books. Case in point, Family, that came out last year, which is just another haunted house story. I was like, can I write a haunted house story that's still different without it being a gimmick? Can I write something that's very organic and very natural? I was like, well, how do I do that? The only thing that you can do with a story is to make it different is you bring yourself to it, because as they say, all these stories have been told a zillion times before. What you bring to it is yourself. So that's what I really tried to do. I was not trying to do anything purposefully different or gimmicky. I was just trying to tell a story with a real family that I was really invested in, with things that scared me, and hopefully that translates to the reader. I mean, it's up to them whether I succeed or not, but I had a hell of a time writing it.
Yeah, I am so excited about the glimpse of this world and all of like the expansive possibilities that exist for it. What you were describing to me sort of reminded me of, I think maybe it was in your first email to me, you mentioned that it was sort of inspired by both X-Files and Twin Peaks. And, I've been deep in mourning for David Lynch, so I've been thinking about him a lot. And something that he does with Twin Peaks that I like that, is possible for this world is that he sort of tells stories that are on like the edge of stories, right? And that kind of gets back to like the what to tell and what not to tell. But he's always hinting at something much larger than what you are seeing on the page or on the screen at that moment. So, yeah, it was just so much fun, and I really can't wait to see where it goes.
Oh, well, thank you. Yeah, and I would say like that was my influences growing up was big time. X-Files, Twin Peaks, I'd say were the two biggest. Just that meshing of police procedural with the supernatural, government conspiracies, and even Twin Peaks. Like the characters are, people always remember like the quirky characters, and I love them too. I love the Log Lady. I love Nadine Hurley and all these people. But it's the interpersonality of them all, not just the quirky ones. Like Twin Peaks was also kind of a parody of soap operas. Like that was what it was. It was trying to do lots of different things at once. And there's some of the stuff I was aware of at the time, and some I was too young to get, because I was a teenager when I was watching at the time. And I've rewatched it many times since. My wife and I just rewatched it recently again, because in honor of David Lynch's memory, we just go back to it so often. But even like, the original TV bromance of Cooper and Truman, one of the best of all time, like it's just, that relationship is so good. So those are the things that inspire me when I work. It's the characters that matter. If you don't care about the characters, you're not going to care what happens to them. That's really what it boils down to. So I really try to invest a lot in Felix. I want to make him, a great, detective character, but I also try to make him different, because I don't want him to be every other PI character. Jerry Baldwin is sort of this quirky, hyperactive friend who's a little obnoxious, but I don't want to make him too obnoxious, because I don't want him just to be a walking punchline. This new story that I wrote with Jerry is he's trying to get a new house available for sale. He starts finding these videotapes around the house that are just showing up, and they're snuff tapes. And the first thing he has to do is he has to find a VCR to play them, because who has a VCR anymore? So it's just, he has to go find a VCR. He plays them. There are these horrible snuff tapes of what he assumes are people who have died in this house. So he has to figure out this mystery, because this is his job. This is what comes up in his daily work. But the two beta readers who have read it so far were really excited, because it gave this depth to Jerry that, one, they had never seen before, and two, they didn't know that he had, because again, he's sort of seen as this, he sells haunted houses for a living. It seems like just like a joke, seems like a punchline. But when you see him here and you realize what he goes through and how he's really invested in this, that was as much fun for me as anything else. I mean, it's a 30,000 word novella, so I got to spend a long time with him in this, and it's a scary story. It's a little fun. The Jerry stories are a little bit lighter. I would never say they're funny. There's nothing funny about the Blacklands world, but tonally they're different than Felix's stories. They're a little bit lighter. Case in point, the story is actually called Much Ado About Snuffing. So, because it's about snuff tapes. So, but again, in typical fashion, he finds this videotape and he doesn't know what's on it, but he knows there's got to be something weird, because it wasn't in the house yesterday when he was visiting the house. And now he just needs to find a VCR to play it. So it was just like, that was just, I went off to the races there, because I'm thinking, can you tell that story today? And it's like, no, you couldn't, because no one has a VCR anymore. So I was like, well, that's the first thing he'll have to do. So you make that part of the plot, you make it funny, you make it interesting, and then you hit them with something really horrible when you hit play. So it's still very much a scary story, but it's very much a Jerry Baldwin story. And that's just something that I like about writing these characters, is Alice herself, when like her first novel is completely outlined and know what it's going to be. You get to meet her first partner, you get to see what she was like, you get to see her background. And she couldn't be more different than Felix and Jerry. I mean, you obviously get a pretty good taste of what Alice is like in Sycamore, but this novel, her first novel, is you get to know everything about her and why she is the way that she is. It's just fun. It's like playing with toys when you were a kid. You're playing with the action figures. This is the adult version of that, where now you just get to write it all down. It's still the same thing. It's still playing,
Oh, that's so exciting. I can't wait to read all these upcoming ones. Thank you so much for coming to talk about your work with me. It's been so exciting. And yeah, if you ever want to come back and talk about the Blacklands again or anything else, you're always welcome. Our door's always open.
Oh, thank you very much, and thank you for letting me prattle on endlessly about this stuff. So as you can tell, I'm pretty excited about it, but that's just the passion. I love doing this, and I just hope I can keep publishing them. As long as people keep reading them, I'll keep publishing them.
Excellent. All right, that means that you have homework, listeners. You're going to check out, at minimum, you are going to check out Sycamore and Every House is Haunted, but you should really be checking out all of the books and stories that we've been talking about today. Please head to your favorite bookstore or library or website, wherever you like to go for your books. Do you have a special place they should go to look for your stuff?
Oh, yeah, you know what? I would just say, they're available everywhere. So I just say, I always feel like you should support the libraries and the smaller bookstores first if you can. But yeah, just get it wherever is easiest and cheapest for you. Is what I would say. Everything's expensive these days. So you got to buy the food first. But books are food for the soul. So buy those too.
Truly. All right. Thank you again. And thank you, listeners, for joining us. It is now time to close this chapter. We'll see you next time.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.